Aloha, this is Mahi Eleni with PTC. Thank you for joining us today for another session of PTC's webinar series, Frictionless Business, sponsored by PCCW Global. We now turn the time over to Elaine Stafford of DRG Undersea Consulting.
Good day. Welcome to this special PTC webinar. My name is Elaine Stafford, and I'm truly pleased that you all joined us today. I'm also extraordinarily pleased to be hosting this panel with such an amazingly insightful set of submarine cable industry leaders. Before I introduce our guests and start the conversation, I'd like to take a peek beyond today to 2022. The Pacific Telecommunications Council is excited to be hosting PTC 22 just 3 short months from now. You can register online. There will be both live and pre-recorded events. And our traditional Sunday submarine cable workshop will be as informative as ever, starting with our Around the World update, followed by informative panel sessions and an update from telegeography. I know some of our speakers are making travel arrangements already to be there. Many of us are looking forward to the reunion. However, recognizing that not everyone will attend in person, we've been working to develop some new and creative online content that we hope everyone will find worthwhile. Perhaps the most exciting new part of the program on Sunday will be a library of individual video vignettes, which we're inviting industry professionals from across the globe to submit. Our collective and individual talents in this industry are vast and varied, and many of us have stories we'd like to share about industry experiences with others. Suboptic, like the Sunday workshop, will host these videos, and they will be more permanently resident on Suboptic's website. We've named the program the Crew Tube, and we're hoping all of you with an inclination to share a short personal story about life in the subsea cable world will consider submitting your own self-recorded vignette. We'll soon post more instructions on the Suboptic website. We already have a couple of dozen individuals signed up to tell stories of life on a vessel, surveying amidst the pirates, landing a cable in a country never before connected, building a cable through the jungle, and more. This is not a program for companies or promotion, but really an opportunity for individuals to share. Please stay tuned for more about CrewTube from PTC and Suboptic. Let's move on to today. We're going to talk about potentially transformative trends in today's submarine cable industry and their impact. The panel we've selected makes my job today simple, as these experts are among the most strategic thinkers in our industry. My job is simply to ask a few questions and then make sure individual enthusiasm does not drown the others out. I'm sure it will be hard to contain the energy and the ideas will flow rapidly. It may be hard for all of you to keep up, but let's introduce the team. We have Virginie Fruin, Chief Sales Officer from Hawaii in New Zealand. Mark Halbfinger, CEO of PCCW Global in Hong Kong. Paul Gobler, Chief Sales and Marketing Officer from ASN in France. Nigel Bailiff, CEO of Aquacoms, located in Ireland, but he's in the UK right now. And last but far from least, Riccardo Rosero, Network Investments of Submarine Cable in EMEA from Facebook in Spain. With those introductions, let's get started. And I'd like to open the floor to Virginie and all of our panelists, but start with her, with a question. What recent or developing trend in the subsea cable world do you believe will have the most transformative impact on global communications 10 years from now? And how do you believe it will change the way we connect? Virginie? You're on mute.
Here I am. Thank you. Thank you, Elaine. Hello to all. Interesting insight here. Look, maybe I'll try four trends, four elements that may impact the 10 years ongoing on the submarine cable networks in the next 10 years. So I'll start with one that is obvious, which is the growth of the data usage. I think in the last 10 years, we've seen a lot of transformation due to the growth. And I think we can expect that in the next 10 years, that growth will actually be much higher than what we've seen in the last 10 years. So the digital infrastructure, I think, will go through a set of transformation due to the fact that it will have to respond to this requirement for high capacity. How will it respond to it? We've seen big technology changes over the last years with optical equipment upgrades, but also changes in the technology of the cable themselves and the repeaters with the new SDM cables. We hear 24 fiber pairs now. Can we hear that about the 48 fiber pairs in the next 10 years? I don't know. But I think growth will be, and the technology evolution will be a big impact on how many cables will need to be built on the different multiple routes for the highway of this core infrastructure. If I can add a second one, will be also another continuation of the trend that we've been seeing. I'm thinking about the computing power, the data centers, and the cables that are becoming the core global digital infrastructure today. And I think this change of connectivity is changing the landscape of the global connectivity. We are moving from a user-centric traffic to a data center centric traffic. I think data centers are becoming the hubs. Probably 80% of the capacity will go data center to data center. They will be, the cables will be the backbones to those new hubs. And I think one of the questions in the next 10 years will be, how do we create those routes between those data centers to enable the right performance, the right diversity, to have a reliable global infrastructure. Two more, if I may add. One is about where we are going to connect, where are going to be those hubs, and what is going to influence the choice of those hubs. I think one that we have seen in the past are the regulations. Cables are recognized as strategic assets today for countries, for their connectivity and their economy. I think this will still be a major influence on how and where we connect the submarine cables. Just to name one of those impact, recently, of course, we have seen that impact on and the disruption of billions of dollars investment across the Pacific, but not only there. And I think that the regulation, whether they are regional or national or international, will be a key parameters for the next 10 years. And maybe lastly, of the four that I picked here, and there will be many others I'm sure we will discuss, is probably a new parameter that is getting more and more an influencer, is the carbon neutrality of the infrastructure. We've seen different organizations making commitments or announcement to build a carbon neutral infrastructure over the next 5 to 10 years. And I think there will be a need for us as individual and as an industry to play our part here and develop a sustainable global digital infrastructure, and find the ways and the innovations to build the data centers and the cables in a carbon neutral ecosystem. So these, I just noted 4 of those challenges. I'm sure there are many more to be discussed here.
Thank you very much, Virginie. We had a very dynamic set of pre-call discussions with all of the panelists today, and a lot of them have similar but complementary views. And I'd like to turn it now to Mark and let him comment with some of his own ideas. And feel free, everybody. I was a little bit joking in my introductory comments, also to interrupt each other. I'd like to keep this dynamic, so I know all of you are full of ideas. Let's bounce around these ideas a little bit. Mark?
But if I start talking, Nigel's going to interrupt me straight away the moment you
No,
do
I'm
that.
not, Mark. No, I'm not.
Yeah,
No,
there
I'm
you
not.
see, right there. He started. That's the way it goes.
Okay, good for you, Nigel.
Yeah.
All right, Mark.
Listen, I think
you had some really interesting thoughts as well before.
Well, Virginie hit many of the nails on the head. If I were to, articulate and offer, there's one that I'd really like to echo and perhaps just call a spade but give a direction to it, and that has to deal with what you refer to as regulatory. I'll call it perhaps geopolitical interests. I think that that's something that everyone is going to have to focus upon. And I hope people focus upon it to the positive. That is, national governments are trying to look after their citizens for whatever reason, and geopolitical interests are being driven by sovereignty issues that are driven sometimes from cybersecurity, sometimes from data privacy laws, and sometimes for what they might view as other forms of national security interests. But at the end of the day, the business that we've been in since the 1850s has been one that focuses on cross-border interoperability. And I think that despite our legal, moral, ethical, political obligations to the governments who issue us our own individual passports, within the industry, we have an obligation to facilitate as much universal service as possible, and to disseminate what we do, and hopefully for the good, and then leave it to governments to figure out the rule basis of what's there. And then we can obviously form our governance teams and compliance teams to make sure that it's there. But I think what Virginia highlighted around regulatory, it's more, in my view, it's more than regulatory, it's geopolitical. And I think it charges us with a mission, not just to read what's in the newspapers and say, oh no, I'm not going to do China, US anymore, but rather to figure out ways that we can function in the new environment that is evolving. Second element that I would highlight, obviously, is technological change that Virginia described around, and Nigel will do a much better job than me on lasers, chips, capacities, and so on, and all that. And I take all that on board. But I'd like to offer up from a technology point of view also that a dramatic amount is happening at the adjacent components of what needs to happen. Code-based work that often the clouds are driving, such as our colleagues here on the panel from Facebook, but also some of the other clouds, whether Western or Asian, whatever, around automation. And what's happening in that space, particularly at the enterprise and service provider level, is going to create demand sets for our capacity that from an end user point of view will be provisioned differently. Imagine that every kilobit of capacity might be provisioned on an on-demand basis per second. We need to be sure that we are facilitating interoperability on an automated basis and BSS and OSS systems that would be able to facilitate that automated interoperability, and particularly as the ICT ecosystems that we deliver to end users are going through very different types of commercial models. Facebook's commercial model monetizes not necessarily by charging a subscription fee, whereas the telcos historically have charged a monthly rate. That's a vast gulf that needs to be mediated in some way, shape, or form. And I think that the technology around systems automation is going to help facilitate that. And the last is capital. We're seeing low interest rates and various other activities has driven an abundance of capital that's being allocated into adjacent components of our industry. Data centers, for example, with very high valuations, or tech that's driving application there. And yet, oddly enough, the capital that's going into this component of what we're talking about at the moment, subsea, has traditionally driven multiples that are a little bit lower than others. Why is that? And that's something that we need to address, because the rest of that ICT ecosystem can't function without the capital allocation to that component as well. And therefore, I think that increasingly what you'll see is some elements of vertical integration and consolidation that takes place in the ICT ecosystem, for particularly this purpose. And in that regard, I do applaud the clouds for the work that they've done in acquiring systems and building them out. I think I was one of the first on LinkedIn to ping Riccardo, who I don't know well, but to say, wow, that's amazing what you've done for Africa, because that's quite critical. That's capital coming in order to deploy value into a geography that is thirsty, hungry for that capital investment. But I hope that capital, no disrespect to Facebook, I hope that capital could be distributed more widely amongst the industry players that are out to deliver it. So I think that, if I were to summarize, it's capital, technology, geopolitics, and the subsets that drive all of those. Those are the big ones that I see as trendsetters that we all need to be paying attention to, regardless of our size or our position in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I'm with you, Mark. I mean, we disagree on some things, but not on the basics there. I mean, because thinking a bit wider about it, what the heck are we here for? What the hell's all this about? People watching this who don't understand our industry or aren't connected to it or part of it, probably aren't even aware. And it's the classic, unawareness of our industry and the silent underground, capability that's fueling the world. I mean, really, our job's connecting everybody and getting them to work creatively, right? And develop things that we wouldn't even develop because we're not in that mindset. But we're trying to create the platform for them to be able to do it as easy as possible. In the last 20 years, we've been really good at it as an industry, creating something where capacity increases, price decreases, all of these things take away any problem somebody might have from acquiring long haul capacity around the globe. And then in the last few years, we've seen an even bigger hike in system size and fiber pairs and capabilities and resilience and all these different factors. So we've done a really good job of making that foundation, but we're just not very visible for it. And I think the regulation piece for me is the big one, because governments are realizing that this is now critical. And I completely take your point about you can't bifurcate the internet. The whole word internet means things need to be connected. You can't separate them. And it's our job to work out how to connect them in a way which is acceptable to all the governments necessary and to follow the different pieces of legislation. But most people are now waking up, most governments, to the fact that these are at least an economic driver equal to an electricity interconnector, or the ability to generate power, or the ability to, farm agri-land and produce food for its citizens. They're just part of the normal consumable. And I think we've done a really good job. We don't shout about it enough outside of our industry in some ways, at helping the world be connected, particularly in this last pandemic. Can't get by not talking about COVID, but the world didn't come to a stop. It actually carried on. A whole number of things, carried on and got done because of our layer, because of our foundation layer that allows people to fairly, generally communicate around the world. And the frictionless title here, wherever it is up here, we're just trying to make it easy for people to use the platform that we're building for them, combine data centers with cables, with tools that allow people to innovatively access them, even if they didn't think they needed them. This is part of the issue. Where somebody wants to globalize a business from the middle of any country, they need the sorts of tools we have to develop, the sorts of technologies and the sorts of capabilities to allow them to project that around the world. And I do think on the regulator side, as a body, as an industry, we're not perhaps as visible and as voluble in terms of talking to regulators about how we see this could be done, fairly, safely, securely. There are many industries through the last sort of 50 to 100 years that have had very good lobbies, very good capabilities to work as an industry, and some of those are ones which are now perhaps on the wane. The oil industries and the certainly the nuclear industries in some countries have very, very strong positions around how governments should be at least accepting of what they're doing, if not open to assisting. So I wonder if the challenge for us is that we do too good a job too quietly, and we don't actually make our presence known enough in some of these regulation circles to try and push regulation in a certain direction.
Nigel, I concur with you. It's interesting that what has happened over the last couple of years. So indeed, geopolitics and regulation are all very important topics. We are seeing a growing awareness of all governments around the globe on a number of topics, including environmental, strategic access, and strategic nature of submarine networks. But I think the positive here is that at least that's what we can see. There is really now a fast-growing awareness of governments around the globe about the importance of submarine networks and facilitating the implementation and deployment of those. And some countries, and you know that because you've been involved in one project recently, where it was a bit difficult, but I think the authorities are now fully realized what's required and to help the industry. And some of them have put in place a concept which I would call the one-stop shop. When you want to establish, get a license, get a permit, etc., you just have to contact one counter, as opposed to having to contact like 5 or 10 different authorities in the same country. So in France, in the UK, etc., I think that realization is really there. I guess in the US it's probably getting there too, and I think around the globe it's a general trend. So that's good because everybody knows now, just as you said, submarine networks are indispensable now in today's life, both for consumers and for companies or corporations. The second comment I'd like to make, reflecting on what my colleague said, is the very fast growth of traffic demand. And what we have seen over the last many years was that technological capability more or less matched growth in traffic demand. So which means that there was always enough supply of capacity compared to the request. But that is because traffic was growing really fast and still is growing really fast in the range of 40% per annum, something like that. But then technology more or less followed something like Moore's law. I don't know what equivalent we could use for submarine technology, but anyway, something like that. And these days, I think technology is growing slightly less fast, which is probably why we are seeing a surge of investment, because then you have to build a few more cables than you had to, just because technology is not growing as fast as before, because all the basic foundational technologies that we are using are now more or less, I would say, almost mature, and therefore now it's really incremental progress as opposed to revolutionary progress like we had when those who have gray hair here remember the introduction of DWDM like 20 plus years ago. That was a revolution because it multiplied capacity by 100-fold, something like that. And then 10 years ago, we had coherent detection, which really revolutionized the way transmission was done in systems and how correction of all the distortions, etc., was processed. So these were really big changes. Right now, we are basically, Virginie said, when will we get 48 fiber pairs? Well, it's just a factor of 2 compared to what we have today. So I think that's the challenge now, is how are we going to find and invent new ways to really make another jump? And at the moment, I don't have any brilliant ideas. There are lots of things that we are working on in the labs, but nothing that at the moment that will multiply by 10 or 100 times.
Can anybody besides me believe that Riccardo hasn't said a word since we started? Riccardo, take yourself off mute, because I know you've got a lot to share with us.
Oh, no, it was fantastic listening to all those experts. I would say I disagree slightly with you, Paul, in the sense that we see technology evolving really at a fast path. I agree with you, current was great, but if I just close my eyes, when we just built our first cable, Marea, it was 8 fiber pairs. Now we are building 24 fiber pair cable in less than 4 years. So that's an incredible factor of 3. We have seen as well, when we just developed Marea, design Marea was 20 terabit per fiber pair, what we could get. Now we get 50% more capacity in the latest test. And there was some press release a couple of days ago about the first multi-core test in the seabed. So I believe that technology is evolving rapidly, and but as you have said, just to match the increasing demand that we are facing right now, I believe that you all have already nailed down a little bit on the regulatory framework, so nothing for me to add on that respect. But I would like to come back to one of the angles that Virginia highlighted before about sustainability, and what I believe would really become a transformation of the industry itself. Right now, on the cable and stations that we are developing to Africa, we are already considering, oh, should we just put solar panels? Should we just include renewable energy sources to feed the cable? But that's only a small part of the equation. If you just look at the marine survey vessels, the mainly vessels, Paul, how much tons of fuel are we burning in that industry when we are deploying submarine cables? So should we just start thinking about hydrogen fuel vessels in the future? That might require a lot of capex right now. Might sound crazy, but when you just look at the standby rates or the transit fees of the vessels, hydrogen definitely will be significantly less expensive than fuel, and of course more carbon neutral. So I believe that it will be interesting to start looking at that part of the industry that since 1850 has not changed dramatically. First burning coal, now burning fuel.
I think
we could go back to installing under sail again, Paul. What do you reckon?
Yeah.
We could, you know, when Mark was a lad at 1850 and the first cables were put in, then it was all done under sail. But it's a fair point, because, you know, we're using an oil-based product to make the polythene, the insulator, and fuel the factory that makes the cable, and then fuel this vessel that lays it. You know, it's a very oil dominant in some ways. But I don't know if anybody's had any thoughts about recovery, because, you know, one thing with the rapid technological advancement, if you move, as Riccardo's saying, from 8 pairs to 24 pairs in a 4 or 5 year cycle, if you're not careful, you get an imbalance between sort of new assets and older assets. And if the new assets have a problem, like all cables randomly could have a cut because of seismology, fishing, anchors, whatever, then you're trying to protect a very, very big 24 fiber pair, 30 terabits per pair cable with maybe some older 6 or 8 fiber pair, 5 or 10 terabits per fiber pair cables, and that gets to be a big disconnect. So, you know, I recovery and reuse and sort of revitalization or renewal of some of the asset that's in the water might be a way to mitigate some of that as well.
Yeah, you're raising a good point, Nigel. Is what is exactly now the useful lifetime of a submarine cable? So we know we build the systems for 25 years. That's the design criteria. But then technical obsolescence and commercial obsolescence probably comes faster than that for the reason that you just mentioned, because the new ones are so much bigger that it doesn't make sense to pay maintenance fees the same for small systems compared to really large ones. So that's one question that is still being debated. What would it change if we started to design for, say, 15 years instead of 25? But nobody's got a perfect answer to that one. But then the question that you raised about protection, I think Riccardo must have a strong opinion on that, because right now, at least that's what we see. The Facebook and the other big system builders these days, they are building parallel routes on this, parallel systems on the same routes to the factor, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 factor redundancy. So I don't know, Riccardo, if you can share us your view on what is let's say the right number. Is it 2, 3, 4, 5? What?
Well, thank you, Paul, for not answering my question addressing the idle fuel run vessels. But regarding the matter of protection, I believe that is building diverse routes. Instead of putting all the eggs in the same basket, as we have seen legacy systems being built in New York and London, and just if something happens, the blast radius could impact some of them. What we see, the trend is building systems on different geographies just to minimize the impact of any natural disaster affecting multiple of those cables. And at the end, coming back to Naya's questions, yes, you cannot protect a big cable with a small cable, but if you have multiple small cables, you can combine them to protect a bigger cable. So there are always ways to protect traffic on that respect.
If the affordability of an older cable with a smaller cross-section is related to the expense of maintaining it, it could be that we historically cycle back to points where the maintenance fees are related to the capacity. You know, ACMA may kill me for saying this, but you know, everything goes in cycles, and historically, the maintenance of cables was based in part on their capacity, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And you know, I wanted to ask the question, but I'm a little bit afraid to put you on the spot. But back to what Virginie said about you know, carbon neutral, and a couple of you others have commented, I would suspect that each of your companies has already taken as an objective to achieve certain goals and have developed certain programs, because this is so important today. Mark, can you talk a little bit about what PCCW is doing in that regard?
Well, we measure, yeah, we happy to do that. First of all, I'll come to the ESG targets in just a moment, but I'll just say, I love Riccardo's comment about hydrogen, but I then refer you back to my trends message about capital, and about, you know, how there's a lot of these different subsystems at the moment. The number of companies that are building subsea systems and maintaining them, you can count on one hand, right? And so you've got an economic incentive associated with capital, and you highlighted it correctly. You're saying, well, some of these cables were built 30 years ago. By the way, very important to correlate that to my governmental trend. Most cables last longer than governments, right? So you're able to think about it in the longer term when you're thinking through that cycle. And that's why, and I personally don't encourage, if we can plan something for 30 years, why do it for 15? Because that already has ESG value, one might argue, but you need to think it through well. The problem with having such a long funnel of time with such dramatic pace associated with technological shift is that you end up where we are today, which is incongruous business models. What you were about to describe in terms of the subsea maintenance organizations in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, in the Pacific, and so on, these guys all started their business models stemmed out of what you may recall the word notional capacity. Right? We don't build systems anymore with notional capacity on consortiums. And for those of you who don't know what it is, go back and look at the consortium dictionaries. There's no reason to do notional because Riccardo just said he's building two systems in two different directions, right? So we don't do notional anymore. But that was how those models started. And the commercial models then expanded with the zone arrangements because there's such a limited amount of ships, et cetera, and so on. So I would say, yeah, we want to have ESG. Now I come to your question about ESG targets. Boards of directors, and I was a little bit late to the call because of that. They want us to line up to various ESG targets, but we're supposed to do that for systems that we built 25, 30 years ago. It's not that easy. And so the question is, are you setting those targets for 1 year from now, 5 years from now, 20 years from now, or 30 years from now? And I don't think there's any board out there that's setting ESG targets for 30 years from now. Even governments are saying clean energy 2030. It's only 15 years away, 17 years away. And we're talking about we're putting a system in the water now in the Mediterranean that's set to last for 30 years. So I think we have to be realistic. And what Nigel was talking about, recovery, and here it's about measuring, monitoring, and seeing the best that we can do within the larger ICT ecosystem. Bear in mind that the business that we do arguably sometimes generates ESG savings. If someone is on a Zoom call instead of getting on a plane, is that a value? Yeah. Well, he's generating energy, he's generating this. We have to find some way to calculate that through the industry and to calculate that through all of these incongruous business models that have evolved because we're on such a long track of time during a period of life when we're living through some inconsistencies. It would be nice if the industry could form together to fund hydrogen-based initiatives, as an example. But then there has to be also a holistic view in the industry of how that's going to take place. And I'm not certain that exists. And I think that there are enough subcommittees out there, and probably Riccardo is going to tell me that there is, that would be able to drive something like that. And here, it would be interesting that governments, instead of regulating to the negative, what we shouldn't do, maybe they could regulate to the positive and help fund and facilitate what we could be doing, not what we should be doing.
And to your point, Mark, we are now probably at the right point of taking those decisions, because if you look at the vessels, the aging of the vessels, the majority of the companies you point out, the vessels are 25, 30 years old. So those vessels need to be replaced within the next decade. So if we left those guys to replace them by another vessels run by fuel, we're just losing a unique opportunity. So I believe that it's more about having a broader discussion about the different players in the industry and see what kind of capital can be brought in order to make that happen.
You know,
but just
fully agree with you.
Will not help.
This is not the direction I thought this conversation was going to go at all, to tell you the truth. The most energy we got in our preparatory discussions was about regulatory in a different context, not directly in terms of geopolitics. But it's interesting that where we're headed is towards how does this industry cooperate? And, you know, in some of Mark's and others of you opening comments, there was the concept that as an industry across the globe, we have a heritage of working together. And to a degree that shifted in many ways over time. And still we have to, by its very nature, cooperate, but we don't quite do it the way that we used to. And the way we used to may not be the right way, but there are many opportunities, and the regulatory framework and building the global network that results in what we all set for our own missions in life was to help the world communicate, is now kind of at a pivotal point. And in my view, to a degree, a lot of that, as somebody said, is in hands of government officials who change much more frequently than people perhaps with a broad vision. So I said that to be particularly provocative, to allow some of you to voice some of your ideas about how we can maybe influence our own destiny and the destiny of the global communications platform a little bit more. Who would like to take that on? Nigel, come on, you were very vocal about this before.
Yeah, I mean, I just wonder if governments push further down the regulatory path and start wanting to take control. I mean, we you know, if we go back to a time when most of us can just about remember in our careers, communications was a national effort. You know, it was the foreign department of the government facilitating a carrier, which was generally at the time the incumbent carrier, building the links between countries based on the requirements, based on size and you know, scope needed. That was the old way of doing it. Does that actually drive further now? Do people start looking to nationalize connectivity, you know, by regulation? I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows how that story is going to pan out. The fact is, it's all about cooperation. All of this is about collaboration and cooperation, because that's what an internet is. It's an interconnected set of things which have to agree how to communicate and work with each other. That's no different from, I don't know, say Mark and I arranging to share traffic over an interface like we have done for 20 years in all kinds of different companies as it is for, governments to agree their regulation point around how they're going to allow competition. The Middle East is different to Europe or to the US. So, I don't know how that's going to form out, but I would suggest that nobody will accept a model where, one or two or three parties have, control over things. I think it's back to Mark's geopolitical conversation, how much control can be extended beyond national borders by governments, and different governments take different views on this. They just want to kind of protect their own shores and look after it that way. Other governments project themselves out around the world to try and take effect at the source of places which they don't particularly agree with. So I honestly don't know how that's going to pan out, but I would suggest in the next 10 years it will change. It will cause some change in our industry. But even when it does, we'll still have to work together to cooperate and integrate all of the different models, whatever they are. We won't be able to have 3 internets in the world or 4 internets in the world.
To your point, Nigel, I believe that what I've heard in the panel is subsea cables are critical, are important. We need more cables. So, in my humble opinion, the only way is deregulation, and as you have mentioned, partnership, and also work with the local governments. Okay, what is the main point of concern that they have? Because maybe if it is cybersecurity, why not we focus on cybersecurity, how we can really mitigate their concerns, but make sure that they facilitate cables to land everywhere elsewhere, and just the industry will develop that infrastructure as it has been doing so far.
I think that's a very interesting comment, Riccardo, because maybe some of the natural inclination of people to think about when you've got a global issue like this is that maybe there should be some regulation to help guide in a direction. And people like me wonder, well, who will help figure out what that regulation should be? But you're actually saying if you remove the barriers, that industry itself will naturally take care of connecting the world a little bit more, maybe like we used to, and maybe looking at it now versus then is not the right way. But I think your thesis was deregulation is
stimulates volume.
Yeah. Anybody got a comment on that?
I think it's aspirational. I don't think, unfortunately, given the current global climate, I don't think that it's currently realistic. I think it's aspirational, and I wonder if the large content providers like Facebook in the West and Tencent in China, or Google and Baidu, whether they have views because traditionally they haven't laid the domestic networks that are necessary to interface to that international element. And where do you draw the line between regulation and deregulation within a jurisdiction or beyond? And does that deregulation happen at, because we're talking here about subsea at 12 nautical miles or whatever the case. So I think I don't want to be cynical about Riccardo's message, because I actually, at a personal level, admire it and applaud it. But I just am considering, the current climate, the fact that that political agendas, geopolitical agendas of so many different jurisdictions around the world, and not just the famous one that's going on at the moment, PRC USA, but rather almost every geopolitical agenda, and particularly ones that share borders, is complex. Even UK EU at the moment is going to become increasingly complex over time, if for nothing else than data privacy, or as Nigel would say, privacy.
So who's in the best position to influence?
Nigel would correctly say privacy. Yeah. Look, the issue is, if you look at the pandemic, even, governments chose to do what they chose to do, and most of the time they chose to close their borders. And some of the regulation in an easy way for data privacy and all those different things, they seem to be reaching for a you know, a blunt tool, which is perhaps closing the borders.
Now that I want to use the COVID-19 story in order to explain why I admire Riccardo's message, but I think it might be mildly unrealistic, just with one sentence. You just described the symptoms of what many governments did, but you didn't get into the operational methodology. In fact, COVID-19 is a completely common global problem afflicting everyone on the planet identically. And yet every jurisdiction on the planet has chosen to deal with it operationally, methodically different. And that's the rub. So here you say, okay, international subsea access is going to be the common denominator facilitating human communication. Let's deregulate. But here you have a common objective, not even a common problem, a common objective. And I gather in realistic terms that most jurisdictions will choose to approach it differently unless so many jurisdictions can sit around a table as we once did in the old days in order to agree treaties on telegraph in the late 1800s, or even Treaty of Melbourne in the 80s, which dealt more with accounting of our traffic in order to get to value sets.
So who's in the best position to influence all of this and to help drive us towards a more positive outcome?
You, Elaine, you're the one.
Oh, come on. No, this is a serious question. Who is it? Is it the industry? And should we be trying to cooperate together to create a common message, or who? I really thought it was interesting, and it's totally true that governments change faster than people with the experience who know how this works. Riccardo, let me not cut you off.
So I believe that we have, for example, ICPC, but this is really quite technical lobby trying to influence the industry. And Nigel has mentioned oil lobbies, nuclear lobbies. I believe that we need really a strong lobby focusing on the economic benefit of the industry, because at the end, everybody is now investing into digital economies, but without submarine cables, digital economy could hardly survive. So I believe that that is the leverage that we should just try coming together and just highlighting all those positive economic elements of that critical infrastructure just to influence governments. So we need people that talk the same language in terms of policy and in terms of dollars, not in terms of the regulation, how we just cross and what is the angle of crossing a cable to other cables.
Virginia took herself off mute. Virginia, what did you want to add?
No, I wanted to add that there is maybe there are some success stories also to look upon and to share with the other countries in the way that you're talking about, Riccardo. So I know well about the Australian and New Zealand context. So in Australia, they have bet on a regulation that is very clear on the connectivity. So it's clear and deterministic process on how you get a license and how you land a cable. You have protected corridors to ensure that your cable is going by law be protected. They have even created incentive sometimes to actually attract new diversity of cable, because they believe that the connectivity of to the country was going to drive the economy, as you were saying. So if I take our example in Hawaii, we had the New Zealand government that supported through their R&E organization, RIANS, to buy on the cable to create an alternative to a monopoly. I think by taking those particular success stories, you see the development of the countries. Australia, if I take Australia, they have two cables now that in the last 5 years, two cables were built to Asia. There is one that is under construction to Middle East. There's been two cables built to the US. Another one is under construction, and there is more to come. So, and that has led to a data center industry where in the next 3 years, there is 100% growth expected in this one. And now, because they have this environment that is so clear and easy, they're taking the next step to actually take the opportunity that the other countries don't take by kind of blocking their regulation and saying, well, we can be a hub or towards Asia, South America, with a cable that has been announced by Chile, to Asia, to Middle East. So there are opportunities. And maybe if the regulation doesn't work, then the cable will go to environments that are more deterministic. And realistic, of course, because there are population pockets that need to be connected. But this is what is happening, and you have countries maybe that will attract more connectivity because they're more green and because they have a very deterministic process. And I'm thinking of New Zealand, for instance, that is a fantastic country for that, with 80% green power, with connectivity that is growing. So will we see something like that goes where the cables are following well, actually something different, a cable-friendly environment, a green economy, sustainability, sustainable. Maybe it's utopist also, but I think there is at least a part of the market that will follow that trend.
Yeah, so I think there are some very good success stories in that regard that help individual countries or subcontinents, if you want to call them, develop and attract cables. And I think what I heard a couple of you guys say is it's creating the story and it's creating the lobbying approach. And how does the industry as a whole do both over and above what ICPC already does, which focuses more on the technical part of that. I know that a lot of people in ICPC take their mission a bit broader, but not quite as broad, I don't think, as what some of you were suggesting. I think, Paul, you've got a golden opportunity here. Would you like to comment?
Yes. Actually, I was about to. So there is another industry body called Suboptic, which aims at representing the industry and addressing the industry issues at large. So it has not yet morphed into a lobbying entity or lobbying power, as Riccardo is suggesting, but that's definitely something that should be thought about and brainstormed, given the quite wide representation of the industry that constitute the Suboptic Association members. So that's one of the topics that indeed we have started discussing, but we are really in the infancy of that development. But that I would say is in the agenda for the next 12 months to see how we can address and collectively approach that problem. Because as you all described, these topics are worldwide. Each government have a different view on those, but the network is whole. The network is a worldwide network, so we should try to facilitate the deployment and an operation of the network globally. And at the end of the day, then it will be the interest of all the players. Even if all players are competitors in some ways, at the end of the day, there's a general common goal, common interest. So that's indeed, Elaine. So thanks for prompting me on that one. So that's one of the topics that we will aim to address, and you will hear more from us, the Suboptic group, in the coming months.
Yeah, we're actually.
I'll just quickly add about ICPC that I think they do outstanding work in a variety of areas, and particularly in leveraging the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. But they don't just represent the ICT side of the business, they also effectively represent the power side of the business and subsea power cables. And we've seen jurisdictional issues subsea between the two. And I'm not certain that the ICT side of the fence is able to get a hearing for the value that it delivers. And often we've discovered that in some jurisdictions, that there will be a preference towards the power cable side underwater. And I think that it's important that if we're talking here about ICT subsea, that we make sure that we're very focused on having a body that would really represent our interests across the broader range of interests to get to what Riccardo was setting as an objective.
And how would you do that, Mark?
I'll leave it to Nigel, but I think to coalesce governments is a big challenge, big challenge, and arguably it should happen through the UN CLOS in some way, shape, or form. It's the only legal tool that can help facilitate some of that thought process. But even that creates geographic demarcation points of what the ultimate objective that Riccardo laid down was, which talks about crossing past the demarcation from international to domestic to facilitate that openness, right? So it's a wonderful objective, as I said, but realistically very complex. I think it needs someone who will take it as their life mission and never give up until
but it can't be.
done.
Yeah, but it can't be an individual. It needs to be a collection of companies who see it as an imperative, right? And I think some of you in some of our private conversations have said that you've got your own policy people trying to work with different policy people in various countries to help this along the way. But we've got to kind of wrap up now. And I actually thought that regulation was going to become the big thing in this discussion, and it has been one of the more important things. My personal view is we're never going to make progress unless the big companies that are involved in this industry put some of their own resources cooperatively to it. And as much as many of you know, I'm involved in Suboptic, and I applaud the mission that Paul laid out. It's a volunteer organization, and it's a matter of confidence in that organization's ability to do something before companies are going to commit resources to back it being a voice of the industry in that regard. And we've got to get through that predicament or find another solution, I think. So we have to wrap up because I know some of you have planes to catch, literally. So I'd like to go around the table, maybe start with you first, Riccardo, this time. Let's go in reverse order and say, answer the question, what practically speaking do you think that we ought to be tackling in this industry to more positively influence how we move in the next 10 years? And it doesn't need to be regulation, even though that's what we've been talking about in the last 10, 15 minutes. But what thing do you think we can practically influence to do better? Riccardo?
Well, I would say that something is in our hands is be more transparent and establish partnership. I have the great example of To Africa, which is the largest cable that has ever come together to be built. And we could not achieve this without being honest, transparent, all the parties investing in the system and working and aligned to get the same goal together. So I believe that if we can really bring that industry to be transparent, open, and everyone partner to each other, not see us as frenemies or whatever, we'll be closer.
Thank you, Riccardo. Paul?
Yeah, I think in the next 10 years, what is really developing now is the ubiquity of submarine network and more generally speaking, fiber optic connectivity. So there are still lots of places which are underserved, and putting in place all the stuff that we discussed over the last hour or so will help bring everybody into the fold and create that truly global connectivity and give equal opportunity to everybody around the globe.
Sounds like a common mission of all of us. Nigel?
Yeah, I think it is a common mission. I mean, short term, I think for me, there's the balance between supply and demand. Demand's accelerating. Supply is harder to grow quickly. You know, you can't instantly go to the supermarket and buy 6 or 10 more main lay cable vessels. So, you know, there's an interesting short term, you know, picture, I think, for the next few years across the globe. But as we start to get more of these partnerships, more of these operating working arrangements that Riccardo's talking about, I think we'll get a stability into how we grow out networks. Paul's right there. We shouldn't forget the people who used to be called on the other side of the digital divide, who aren't connected at all at the moment, or if they are, they're connected via, very slim and perhaps, small numbers of cables. So that's another opportunity to look at this more holistically around the world with the UN focus and create the ubiquity of connection for everybody.
Yeah, universal service was something that came hand in glove with a lot of regulations in the past. And Riccardo has accomplished a degree of that with what he's doing to Africa by connecting a lot of the smaller countries. But there are some areas that are still definitively left behind. Mark, your turn.
Listen, I love what Riccardo is saying about transparency, which I also feed into a message that Paul is talking about, interoperability, which has been a big mantra of ours for a long time. And I echo Nigel's message completely. I'm wearing my T-shirt today, which is from our service and assurance team. And so I want to call out all of the colleagues that are out there working operations 24/7 worldwide for all of our organizations on ships, deploying and maintenance. They're unsung heroes of this industry. And I want to offer just a different message about how we can get things going. That's by building out the youth that would get engaged in this industry. There are very few university courses, if any, about what we do. And I really think that we have to sort of disseminate this knowledge. If it's going to become more robust in an industry of value, we need to get a lot more people involved around the world. And maybe that youth would then facilitate the transparency that Riccardo was referencing and the interoperability that Paul is forecasting. And I'm quite convinced that they'll play to Virginia's sustainability message. So that would be mine. And I want to thank you very much for allowing us to contribute to this discussion.
Virginia.
Mute.
Here it is, second time. Yeah, I think here the keyword that I like hearing is partnership. I think there are opportunities for more and more partnership to all drive towards the same aim, whether it's having the best regulation and explaining the best regulation, or yes, creating sustainability into all across the industry, or connecting and bridging the digital divide. It's things we've been looking into and all this, and I think all of us, and together we are of course stronger to do all this, and I hope this is the way we're going.
Just in closing, let me say that I'm always awed by the insights that you guys always provide at these panels. And one thing that comes out of this is that we do know what the answers are. We just haven't figured out how to get there. And we all have a common objectives in mind to do better for building out the global communications infrastructure for the world at large. And to Mark's point, we all know also that we've all got too much gray hair. Sorry, Virginia, but not you. And that we really need to do better at capturing the enthusiasm and the capability and the drive that the younger generation can provide us. We just have to find a way to cooperate. We want to cooperate, but we haven't found a way to cooperate amongst ourselves to do all the things we can imagine that we could do. And therein lies the challenge. And maybe we can talk more about that on another occasion. Maybe it'll be something that comes up at PTC. Practically solving the problems is the real challenge. But we all know they're there. But thank you so much, all of you, for making your time available and sharing your insights. It was really an interesting conversation. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.